Today, we're going to talk about cannibalism. But first, we're going to talk about trees, fish, and pop. According to legend, there was an economics professor who had 4 teenage sons. Every week, he would go out and buy several 2-liter bottles of pop. But his sons would guzzle all of that pop in just a few days, and the professor was spending more and more money just trying to keep pop in the fridge. But then the professor had an idea. He bought 4 2-liter bottles of pop and wrote each boy's name on one of those bottles. And the boys stopped guzzling the pop immediately. In fact, there was some pop left over at the end of the week. So why did simply putting names on those bottles of pop change the boys' behavior? Well, the professor realized that they were falling prey to something called the tragedy of the commons. When a resource is easily depleted, but access is unrestricted, then a vicious cycle can set in. Even if you want to save some for later, you can't prevent somebody else from taking it. So you take as much of it as you can now before someone else can get to it. But with everybody following that logic, the resource gets pillaged immediately rather than being used sustainably. And that's what was happening with the teenage brothers. Even if one of them wasn't thirsty immediately, he knew that if he waited, his other brothers would just drink the pop. So they all drank as much as possible, as soon as possible. The professor's dad changed the whole dynamic by assigning specific pop bottles to specific boys. Now the boys didn't have to worry about their brothers drinking their pop, and they knew that if they saved it for later, it would still be there. This is more than just a fun story about sibling rivalry. This is how we end up with environmental problems like clear-cutting and overfishing. Take commercial fishing. The fish in the ocean are a depletable resource, but there are few limits on the number of boats that can go out and catch fish. The fishing companies know perfectly well that they're pulling fish out of the ocean at an unsustainable rate. The problem is they also know that if one of those fishing companies tries to conserve some fish for the future, those fish are not going to be there because one of their competitors will come in and fish them out in the meantime. That's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. If you don't take it now, somebody else will, so you might as well take as much as you can. But as a result, of course, the fishing stocks are depleted below a sustainable level, and that's bad for everyone, including the fishermen. The same dynamic can lead to clear-cutting trees. In the West African country of Niger, trees were once considered common property, owned by everybody. But that meant that even if a tree was on your land, you couldn't legally prevent somebody else from coming in and cutting down that tree for firewood. And if you can't prevent someone else from cutting down the tree, there's no point in conserving it for the future because it's not going to be there. So everyone cut down as many trees as possible, as quickly as possible, just to make sure that they would get to the trees before somebody else did. As a result, the loss of shade dried out the soil, and the loss of roots led to erosion, and the country was in danger of turning into a desert. It all changed when the government made trees private property. If a tree was on your property, you could legally prevent other people from cutting it down. Overnight, people changed their behavior and started using the trees more sustainably. Instead of cutting them down, they let them grow, and they only occasionally harvested seeds and branches, just like the teenage boys changed their behavior when their incentives changed. So what does all that have to do with cannibalism? In his 2005 book, Collapse, scientist Jared Diamond looks at Easter Island. The island was originally home to forests of large trees, which the native Polynesians used for firewood, for building materials, and most importantly, for large seagoing canoes. The Easter Islanders got something like 90% of their food from offshore fishing, so they really needed those canoes for their food supply. Each canoe would last 5 or 6 years, but then it would get waterlogged and have to be replaced. But over several hundred years, the Easter Islanders cut down every single tree on the island. Once their canoes wore out, they were cut off from their main food supply of fish. And it's not like they could escape to another island because they also needed the canoes to travel over the ocean. So the Easter Islanders starved, their populations crashed by 90%, and they resorted to cannibalism. In his book, Jared Diamond asks, that guy who walked up to the very last tree on the island with an axe, what was he thinking? Well, an economist understands exactly what was going on. Because the trees were a common resource available to everybody, the Easter Islanders were trapped in a tragedy of the commons. That guy cutting down the very last tree on the island was thinking, well, if I don't cut down this tree, someone else is going to. Without a way to protect the trees from other people, there's no point in trying to save them for the future, because they're not going to be there. So the next time you hear about how we are depleting our resources, look more carefully and see if it's actually a tragedy of the commons. And by the way, who am I? I'm Patrick Walsh. I'm an associate professor of economics at St. Michael's College near Burlington, Vermont.